In 1846, a French naturalist named Auguste Aymard was working through fossil remains recovered from Oligocene deposits in the Auvergne region of central France, when he came across the skull of something he didn't have a modern comparison for. Massive, elongated, armed with heavy, unreduced teeth running the full length of the jaw, front to back, without the gaps or specializations you'd expect in most later mammals. Aymard gave it a name built entirely around that one anatomical detail, Entelodon from the Greek entelos, meaning complete or full, and odon, meaning tooth. The complete toothed one, that's it, that's the whole name. Not hell, not monster, not terror. A dry, technical, almost bureaucratic Latin label describing a full set of teeth. It would take more than a century and a considerable amount of documentary narration before this animal picked up the name most people actually know it by. Hell pig. And the gap between those two names, the clinical one a scientist actually gave it, and the theatrical one popular culture bolted on decades later, is basically the whole story of how badly this animal has been misunderstood. Entelodonts, the broader family Aymard's discovery belongs to, thrived across an enormous stretch of time and geography, appearing at the late Eocene and persisting into the early Miocene, roughly a 20 million year run, with fossils turning up across North America, Europe, and Asia. Aymard's original Entelodon material came from France, but some of the best-known and best-studied members of the family come from Western North America, where a somewhat smaller, earlier genus called Archaeotherium turns up in genuine abundance across Badlands formations, common enough that paleontologists have had the luxury of studying entire populations, rather than single lonely skulls. And then, right at the tail end of the family's run, North America produced the biggest one of all. In 1878, the American paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope, working from admittedly fragmentary remains, described a new genus he named Daeodon, with the type species Daeodon shoshonensis. Later, more complete skeletal material confirmed just how enormous this particular Entelodon actually was. Adult skulls stretching close to 90 centimeters, nearly 3 feet, on an animal estimated to have stood as tall as 1.9 meters at the shoulder, around 6 feet 2, and weighed as much as 750 kilograms, close to 1,650 pounds. Picture something built along roughly the general proportions of a wild boar, then stretched until its shoulder height alone is taller than most adult humans, and you're most of the way to picturing an adult Daeodon standing in front of you. Here's where the popular reputation kicks in, and it's not hard to understand why. A skull nearly a meter long, an unbroken run of heavy teeth, and a face covered in strange, jagged, asymmetrical, bony flanges projecting outward from the cheekbones, features that show up more prominently in males than females across the family, gave this animal an appearance that documentary producers and museum exhibit designers have leaned into for decades. Snarling reconstructions, blood-soaked muzzles, the nickname Hell Pig, or in some circles the even more dramatic Terminator Pig, both of which paint a picture of a relentless wolf-pack-style apex predator running down anything unfortunate enough to share its territory. It's a great story. It also isn't a particularly accurate one, and the actual evidence for what these animals were doing with those teeth tells a considerably stranger, more interesting story than pure predation ever could. Start with the flanges themselves, those jagged, bony projections flaring out from the cheeks, because for a long time, their purpose was genuinely unclear. Two explanations have generally competed for the best answer, and current thinking suggests they're probably not mutually exclusive. One possibility is mechanical, that these flanges provided extra surface area for the anchoring of powerful jaw muscles, functionally similar to how certain ridges and crests on other skulls throughout the animal kingdom exist purely to give chewing muscles more real estate to attach to. The other possibility is social, that these structures functioned as a visual signal, a display feature, and quite possibly a genuine piece of defensive or offensive equipment during conflict with other Entelodonts. The same basic category of feature you'd find on a set of antlers or a lion's mane, something that says something about the individual carrying it to every other member of its own species nearby. And we don't have to guess entirely in the dark on that second option, because Entelodont fossils have actually preserved direct physical evidence of exactly that kind of conflict happening. Paleontologists examining Entelodont skulls have documented puncture wounds and healed over scratches. some cutting as deep as 2 centimeters into the bone, in patterns consistent with these animals biting each other, specifically targeting the face, in encounters violent enough to leave permanent marks but survivable enough that the wounds show clear evidence of healing afterward. That's an important detail. These weren't kills. They were fights that both animals walked away from, at least often enough to leave a healed scar behind as proof. The behavior this evidence points toward has a genuinely striking modern parallel, and it comes from an animal most people would never think to compare to a giant prehistoric pig relative. Hippopotamuses today engage in a behavior sometimes described as jaw wrestling, opening their mouths as wide as physically possible, and shoving, locking, and grappling jaw to jaw with a rival. A ritualized, often non-lethal test of strength, typically fought over territory, food access, or mating rights rather than food itself. Entelodont face-biting looks in the fossil record, remarkably like the same basic strategy, animals of the same species, testing each other's strength jaw to jaw, occasionally drawing blood, rarely, if ever, actually killing each other in the process. Which raises an obvious question. If entelodonts were fighting each other this way, and that hippo comparison keeps coming up in the research, how closely related to a hippo is this animal actually supposed to be? The answer, once modern phylogenetic analysis got involved, turned out to be the single biggest twist in this animal's entire story. And it's one this channel has actually run into before. A 2009 study examining the deeper evolutionary relationships within Artiodactyla, the broad order of even-toed, hoofed mammals, found that Entelodonts group most closely not with true pigs, the family that includes modern wild boars and domestic pigs, but with Whippomorpha, the specific branch of the Artiodactyl family tree that contains hippos, and, through hippos, connects directly to whales. Entelodonts have hooves and superficially resemble oversized, monstrous pigs, closely enough that the whole family picked up a pig-adjacent nickname, but on the actual family tree, current evidence places them closer to hippos and whales than to any pig alive today. Which means that jaw-wrestling comparison to modern hippos isn't just a loose behavioral analogy, dreamed up for a documentary script. It might be an echo of genuinely shared ancestry, a fighting style retained, or independently rediscovered, by two distantly related branches of the same broader family tree, one of which eventually gave up land entirely and swam off into the ocean. So if these animals weren't dedicated predators locked into a wolf pack hunting lifestyle, and a meaningful amount of their most dramatic-looking anatomy was actually built for fighting each other rather than tearing apart prey, what were they actually eating day to day? This is where dental microwear analysis, the study of microscopic scratch and pit patterns left on tooth enamel by whatever an animal has actually been chewing, becomes the most useful tool available. Because it doesn't rely on guessing from tooth shape alone, it reads direct physical evidence of real diet left behind in the teeth themselves. That evidence points toward an omnivore's diet, broadly comparable to what you'd find in a modern wild boar, not the diet of a dedicated hypercarnivore, like a wolf or a big cat. Entelodonts appear to have been opportunistic feeders, capable of processing both plant material and animal matter, adjusting what they actually ate based on seasonal availability. The same way a modern boar, or for that matter, a modern bear, shifts its diet across the year rather than specializing narrowly on hunted prey. Daeodon specifically is noted to have possessed an unusually large olfactory lobe, the brain structure associated with processing smell, a feature that suggests an especially sharp sense of smell well suited to detecting carcasses or food sources of any kind. Across long distances, the kind of adaptation you'd expect from an opportunistic scavenger and forager, rather than a pursuit predator relying primarily on speed and stealth. Put all of that together, and the actual animal that emerges looks nothing like the snarling wolf pack hunter from the documentaries, and honestly, it's a stranger and more interesting creature for it. A massive, hoofed, distant cousin of hippos and whales, standing taller at the shoulder than most humans in its largest North American form, carrying a skull built as much for intimidating and grappling with its own rivals as for eating, covered in bony facial flanges, that most likely doubled as both anchor points for a powerful bite and as a genuine signal of status and combat readiness to every other entelodont nearby. An animal that ate whatever the season and its own keen sense of smell put in front of it, plant or animal, fresh kill or old carcass, rather than living the single-minded, predatory lifestyle its modern nickname implies. And an animal whose entire menacing popular reputation, Hell Pig, Terminator Pig, rests almost entirely on a face full of bony ridges, evolved primarily to help it fight members of its own species, not to hunt yours. There's a version of this that circles back nicely to something we've talked about on this channel before, because Andrew's Arcus, the giant mystery skull from a couple episodes back, was itself once compared directly to Entelodonts by researchers trying to figure out what its own single surviving skull actually belonged to. It turns out that comparison was more prophetic than anyone realized at the time, because both animals, entirely independently, ended up reclassified onto the same general branch of the mammal family tree, closer to hippos and whales than to any predator either one was originally compared against. Somewhere in the Cenozoic, the lineage that eventually produced the ocean's largest animals also produced two of the land's most convincingly monstrous-looking mammals, and both of them spent the better part of a century getting their entire personality assigned to them by researchers working with nothing but a skull and their own imagination. Auguste Aymard named this animal for its teeth in 1846, and never once suggested it belonged in hell. That part came later from people who never had to actually classify the bones, just narrate over them. The real animal was something odder and, honestly, more believable. A huge, hoofed, distant hippo relative that mostly just wanted to eat whatever it could find and occasionally slam its face into a rival's over territory. Or a mate, the same basic argument its modern cousins in the rivers of Africa are still having today. That's the Hell Pig story, the way the evidence actually tells it. Let me know in the comments what you want catalog next, and subscribe to ClawCatalog if you want to be here for it.